All right, let's just dive right into this. When we think about the Ming Dynasty and Imperial China, our minds usually jump straight to the incredible architecture of the Forbidden City, maybe that beautiful blue and white porcelain, or obviously the emperors themselves. But today, in this explainer, we're going to look right past those grand palaces. We are digging into the massive, completely incomprehensible scale of the imperial harem. And we're not starting with the buildings, we're starting with a single terrifying moment in a young girl's life.
Picture this. You're just 14 years old, and one day, government inspectors literally show up at your family's front door. They aren't there to collect taxes or anything like that. They're there to inspect you. They measure your height, they meticulously check your teeth, they examine your hands, they even smell your breath. They're searching for absolute, flawless, physical perfection and a totally calm disposition. And here is the absolute kicker, the truly chilling part of all this. Your father cannot turn them away. Saying no is simply not an option that exists in this reality. 3 weeks later, you are loaded into a convoy, and you're carried through the largest gates you've ever seen in your life. Gates so tall they literally block out the sun. And you know, deep down, that once they close behind you, you are never, ever coming out. Which brings us to the sheer, mind-boggling scale of the population inside those walls. The Forbidden City wasn't just a lavish home for the imperial family. It housed roughly 3,000 women. Think about that number. 3,000 women who existed on paper and in harsh reality entirely for one single human being, the emperor.
To put that kind of captivity into perspective, we're talking about 9,000 rooms spread across a sprawling 180 acres. Surrounded by a massive moat and walls that were 35 feet high, the Forbidden City operated less like a traditional royal palace and way more like a massive, inescapable machine, literally designed to process and warehouse human lives. So, moving into Section 1, the gates close forever, the reality of selection.
Once you pass through those massive gates, well, the bureaucratic machine basically treated you like cargo. You're immediately bathed, reclothed, and just assigned a number in a registry ledger. Sure, your old name technically still existed, but nobody was going to use it anymore. You weren't a daughter anymore. You were merely a concubine candidate. Your entire past identity completely stripped away.
The real heartbreak here is the absolute whiplash between a family's reality and the required public face. Imagine grieving quietly, knowing you've lost your daughter forever, right? But outwardly, because you received a slight title bump and some silver, you were forced to smile and brag to your neighbors about what an incredible honor it was that she was off serving the emperor. Just a brutal psychological toll.
Right, moving on to Section 2, the Pyramid of Power, navigating the imperial harem.
Now, you might be thinking they all lived together in some sort of unified sisterhood once inside. Absolutely not. They entered a rigidly terrifying hierarchy. And the gap between the top and the bottom wasn't a step, it was an absolute cliff. At the top, you've got the empress, chosen from nobility, basically untouchable. But look at the bottom. The vast, overwhelming majority of these women were thousands of completely unnamed palace women, known as gongnu, who literally received no official rank at all.
Where you landed on that pyramid literally dictated every single aspect of your survival. If you were unlucky enough to land at the bottom as a gongnu, your daily reality meant incredibly meager, strictly controlled food rations. It meant sleeping crammed in a room with 12 other women. It meant waking up before dawn to clean or sew and waiting around in courtyards for instructions that might never actually come, and realizing you'd probably never even catch a glimpse of the emperor's face.
But, okay, what if you were chosen? On the exceedingly rare occasion a woman was selected for the night, a eunuch would present this tray of jade tablets to the emperor, each with a name. If your tablet was turned face down, you were carried to the emperor's chambers, wrapped tightly in a robe. Actually, let me clarify that. You were physically carried to make absolutely sure you couldn't smuggle in any weapons. The pressure on that one moment was unimaginable. Your whole future, your only ticket out of the bottom tiers, relied entirely on conceiving an heir from that single, brief encounter.
This brings us to Section 3, Enforcers of the Inner Court, the eunuch machinery.
You literally cannot understand how the Forbidden City functioned without looking at the men who actually ran the day-to-day operations. By the mid-Ming Dynasty, an absolutely staggering 70,000 eunuchs were employed by the palace. 70,000. That's a whole city's worth of administrators.
They managed the complex supply chains, they strictly controlled who got access to the emperor, they delivered messages, recorded births, and maintained this intense, constant daily surveillance over the women in the inner court.
And we've really got to decode the incredibly dark euphemisms the imperial court used to describe this specific workforce. They called the process Jingxin, which loosely translates to purification. Yeah, purification. That was their polite word for the brutal physical reality of castrating young boys, sometimes as young as 8 years old. Families would often voluntarily pay for this horrific operation, because becoming a eunuch meant securing incredibly stable government employment and a chance at massive political power.
Since these eunuchs were the only men legally permitted inside the inner court, you had these highly complex, unusual dynamics form between them and the palace women. And of course, the court had another euphemism for this, duai-shi, or paired eating. This was just the polite cover term for the deep, sometimes highly transactional, but often genuinely romantic connections formed by two groups of deeply isolated people just desperately seeking some form of human companionship.
But a few women actually managed to hack this terrifying system perfectly. Take Lady Wan, for example. She started out as a low-level servant girl with absolutely zero family connections, yet she became the favored companion of the Qinghua emperor. How? She ruthlessly controlled access to him. And if rival concubines managed to get pregnant, she systematically orchestrated the end of those pregnancies. Through proximity, immense patience, and just sheer ruthlessness, she basically ruled the inner court with an iron fist for 2 whole decades.
Okay, Section 4. The price of the emperor when the Son of Heaven dies.
So what exactly happens to thousands of completely isolated women when the one single man they're tied to finally dies? Sure, you had total unicorns like the Ming Emperor Shaozong, who famously said no thanks to the whole system and entirely refused to take concubines, staying totally faithful to his empress. But he was a massive anomaly. For the vast majority of Ming emperors, their deaths triggered catastrophic, systemic consequences for the thousands of women tied to their reign. The end-of-life practices did shift over time, but honestly, neither option was good. Pre-1435, the standard practice was straight-up human sacrifice. Surviving women were fed a final, lavish meal, handed a piece of white silk, and buried, very often alive, with the deceased emperor. After 1435, the system evolved. It changed to forcing these surviving concubines to shave their heads, wear pure white, and live out the rest of their natural lives in supervised, mandatory grief in a psychological prison they chillingly named the Palace of Longevity.
Which leads us to our final part, Section 5, Built to be Forgotten, the Erasure of History.
Zooming out to the macro level for a second, you realize this erasure wasn't an accident. It was literally baked right into Ming law through the household registration system, the huji. Once registered, these women were legally absorbed into the imperial machine, stripped of all independence. They couldn't own a single piece of property, they couldn't bring a lawsuit, they couldn't even send a quick letter to their grieving families without a eunuch reading it first. They were completely and wholly classified as imperial property.
When you look at the raw numbers, the human cost of this 300-year bureaucratic system is it's staggering. Historians estimate that somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 women lived and died inside the walls of the Forbidden City across the entire span of the Ming Dynasty. Tens of thousands of lives systematically processed and locked away.
And how did history remember them? Spoiler alert, it didn't. History obsessively recorded the emperors, their massive military victories, their poetry. But these tens of thousands of women, they were reduced to nothing more than ink and administrative ledgers. And to make it infinitely worse, most of those ledgers were intentionally burned and turned to ash when the Ming Dynasty finally collapsed. The system didn't just lock them away in life, it tried to completely delete them in death. Today, you've got upwards of 40 million tourists wandering through those exact same 9,000 rooms every single year, snapping beautiful photos of the architecture. But as we wrap up this explainer, we really have to pause and ask ourselves a pretty profound question. The Forbidden City was absolutely built to last forever, but who gets to write history and whose lives were purposefully, meticulously designed to vanish? I really hope this deep dive has given you a totally new perspective on the invisible machinery of the past. Thanks so much for joining me to explore the dark truth of the Imperial Harem.